Hello and welcome to our Bible study, our continuing study now of the Gospel of Matthew. This is part 15, which is a lot, but there's still plenty to go. It's such a rich book with so much to offer. And we are finishing up today book 4 of the 5 books that comprise the Gospel, the kind of core structure of the Gospel. So we're in Matthew chapter 17, and I'm Pastor Jack Price, in case you did not know, and welcome to this Bible study. Matthew 17, the first 8 verses, 1 through 8, it's a story we call the Transfiguration of Jesus. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John. That was James's brother John, not Jesus' brother John, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." And while he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." And when the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up, do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. So the story of Jesus' transfiguration is one of the few stories that is included in all 4 of the biblical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It begins 6 days later, and of course that could be 6 days from how chapter 16 ended, but it's also a reference to Exodus chapter 24, beginning in verse 9, when God's glory was on the mountain for 6 days. It reflects an experience of the divine dimension of Jesus with a shining face and radiant clothing, speaking of God's glory. Peter offered to build 3 dwellings, 3 booths, so to speak, and that was an apocalyptic reference as God came to dwell with the people. The appearance of Moses and Elijah reflect the Jewish expectation that these 2 men who had apparently not tasted death. You remember that Moses, it said he died and that God buried him, and no one knows where that place was. So there's some mystery and uncertainty in that. And then, of course, Elijah was taken straight up to heaven in the fiery chariot without dying first. That these 2 would come to herald the coming of the final age. And God reaffirms that Jesus is the chosen one. And in many ways, it's the summary. This story is the summary of all that God was doing in Jesus. Yet the kingdom was not arriving in its fullness. Not yet. Jesus still had to go to Jerusalem and suffer. This was a foretaste, if you will, of glory divine. There was much more than the disciples could see in this story. And yet the reality was clear. The reference is made. It's Jesus alone. Okay, Jesus, from Matthew 17, the next few verses, starting in verse 9, going through 13. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." And the disciples asked him, "Why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" And he replied, "Elijah is indeed coming and will restore all things. But I tell you that Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but they did to him whatever they pleased. And so also the Son of Man is about to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them about John the Baptist. So following that transfiguration, as Jesus, James, John, and Peter were going down the mountain, Jesus, again, as he's done before, ordered the disciples not to say anything, not until after all that had been accomplished. We must wonder if Jesus was maybe missing Elijah and Moses too. They were his heavenly companions. They represented a part of his experience, his life perhaps, that these disciples could not provide. But the verses about Elijah may well have been a later addition, offering a sort of proof that Jesus was indeed the Messiah, since Elijah in the person of John the Baptist had already come. Going on, verses 14 through 18. When they came to the crowd, a man came to him, knelt before him, and said, "Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is an epileptic, and he suffers terribly. He often falls into the fire and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, but they could not cure him." Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you? How much longer must I put up with you? Bring him here to me." And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was cured instantly. So, several things. The juxtaposition of the surreal mountain experience with the pain encountered in the valley reflects, in many ways, our whole faith experience, in which we have wonderfully sublime experiences of what seems to be holy and spiritual with the very difficult pain of life. Jesus was met by a crowd of people filled with an abundance of pain and suffering, really represented by this man with the epileptic son who could not be healed by the disciples. So they brought him to Jesus. And his situation was truly horrible. And Jesus' reaction was maybe reminds us of ourselves sometimes. It was not positive in many ways. It was very negative toward the I don't know if it was the crowd or the disciples or the man. It's hard to know. I suspect toward the disciples. But I think in this story, the healing is not really the key. It's not an end in itself. It was the connection with God that truly mattered. Jesus was very much still focused on that connection with the divine up on the mountain. And it's out of that the disciples were not able to heal, but Jesus was. Going on, verse 19 to 23. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, "Why could we not cast it out?" And he said to them, "Because of your little faith. For truly I tell you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you'll say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you." As they were gathering in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and on the third day he will be raised." And they were greatly distressed. So, commentators say that this passage was probably the reason the whole story of the healing of this epileptic son was included. The image of a mustard seed and removing the mountain are both hyperbole. Even that tiniest amount of real faith that allows you to step out into your fear, can accomplish unbelievable results in terms of good works. Mountains, of course, that's a rich image for things that we face and people that we face. But after that, Jesus again predicts his passion and death. This is the second of 3 times that he does this, and it's almost like a bell tolling in the gospel. The story goes on, and then, bong, I'm going to Jerusalem to suffer and die. And it goes on, and then, bong, that passage and that reminder is a constant reminder just when we're ready to forget about it. Going on, Matthew 17, 24 to 27. When they reached Capernaum, the collectors of the temple tax came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the temple tax?" And he said, "Yes, he does." And when he came home, Jesus spoke of it first, asking, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take toll or tribute? From their children or others?" And when Peter said, "From others," Jesus said to him, "Then the children are free. However, so that we do not give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook. Take the first fish that comes up. When you open its mouth, you will find a coin, and give it to them for you and me." Well, what an unusual story. Yes, it's miraculous and marvelous, but I don't think that's the point of the story. This section may well represent the beginning of Jesus' Book 4 teaching discourse. Many scholars mark it beginning here. Jesus loved the temple. That's why its abuse gave him such pain. Certainly he paid the temple tax. That seems pretty clear that he would have, and he said he did. This passage seems to reflect a later time, perhaps, the early church at the time of the editing of this gospel later in the 1st century. They were and had become estranged from Judaism, But the point of the story is that they are still God's precious children. They are the children. Therefore, they're not required to pay, only the outsiders. But they also were feeling like outsiders. Yet to avoid disrepute, they would pay. They would remain loyal to the temple. The coin found in the fish might reflect Peter's vocation as a fisherman. You do what you do, and you'll find that your life will be able to continue with this balance between loyalty to the temple and Judaism, but the new faith in Jesus. So now we're into Matthew chapter 18, the first 4 verses. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest of the kingdom of heaven?" We've heard this question before, haven't we? He called a child whom he put among them and said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like a child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." So again, Jesus' teaching discourse, marking the end of book 4, has certainly begun by this point, if not at the end of chapter 17. Its focus, like the whole teaching discourse, is how do you be church? What about the administration of church? How do you make these things happen? How do you make your choices and your priorities? The child is not just determined by age, but by the innocence of trust, those characteristics we think of as childlike. And so that childlike quality is the mark to which we should aspire. And that should color all of what we do as church. Chapter 18, verses 5 to 6. "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. If any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believe in me, it would be better for you if a great millstone were fastened around your neck and you were drowned in the depth of the sea." The church should welcome those who are innocent and trusting, and we should all aspire to be that way, to be open, to be taught, not manipulative or domineering, but hopeful and in need of guidance. How terrible a thing for anyone to cause such an innocent one to lose that trust. We as individuals and we as the church face that challenge when, through hypocrisy or hatred, we cause those in need of faith to lose their trust in us, to lose their trust in church. And it's a fearsome judgment we face when we do that. Chapter 18, verses 7, 8, and 9. "Woe to the world because of stumbling blocks. Occasions for stumbling are bound to come, but woe to the one by whom the stumbling block comes. If your hand or foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to enter life maimed or lame than to have 2 hands and 2 feet and to be thrown into the eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out and throw it away. It's better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into the hell of fire." Stumbling blocks. That is what Peter was to Jesus when Peter rebuked Jesus for speaking plainly about his death. Like medical doctors, we should strive first to do no harm. In a very harsh analogy, a medical amputation to save one's life is far better than allowing an infection, the infection of hypocrisy and the practice of faith, to go unchecked. Churches should exist to hold space as sacred so that people can cultivate their soul's own presence. This requires a gentle openness. But sometimes those communities instead try to indoctrinate or motivate or manipulate people toward believing certain things, acting in certain ways, supporting certain causes, or opposing certain points of view. And when this happens, we all miss the opportunity to invite the timid soul to show itself, and we miss the chance to fulfill our calling. This is true of all churches, that we want to be church the way Jesus wanted us to be church. We need to hold open space so that the timid souls can show themselves. Chapter 18, verses 10 through 14. "Take care that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you, in heaven their angels continually see the face of my Father in heaven. What do you think? If a shepherd has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one who went astray? And if he finds it, truly I tell you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that never went astray. So it is not the will of your Father that in heaven that one of these little ones should be lost. The sin of contempt is a very bad one for the church. Whether despising these little ones, and remember, these are not necessarily just children, but these are the innocents, these are people we don't always think about, we don't always see. But the despising of these little ones, whether in the form of abuse or neglect or failing to nurture them, is an affront to God. The admonition is that when a little one goes astray in behavior or drops out, don't write them off. Go get them, bring them back, love them, hold them in Jesus' name. Chapter 18, verses 15 to 18. If another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when two of you are alone. And if the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take one or two others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and as a tax collector. Truly I tell you that whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. So this teaching on church discipline certainly reflects the will of Jesus, but seems also to reflect the later time when there was church organization to manage. The point here is to encourage love and patience, not judgment. Don't get to the writing off place too soon, but pursue in love. What is bound on earth is bound in heaven reminds us that we are here on earth to learn, to love, to relate, to grow as spiritual people. The development of our spiritual lives here and now has a profound effect on our capacity to experience life after this life. Okay, and this is the last section, chapter 18, verses 19 to 20. Again, truly I tell you that if 2 of you agree on earth about anything you ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them. So this does not mean if you agree, 2 of you agree that you're going to take over the world, that'll be done. And it also points out how difficult it is for people in church to agree on much of anything. The community reaching out in love to restore relationship, which is the point here, with one who is lost to that community, has the presence of Christ in that practice. 2 or 3 is not a literal requirement, but a reference to more than one, that the community reaches out and embraces. Matthew 18, 21 to 22. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? And Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times. Or 7 times 70. You know, different translations say different things. And 70 times 7, 490 times to forgive. Well, that's, again, taking it literally and kind of an intellectual action, whereas forgiveness always is a matter of the heart. And so I think the idea is that you always forgive. It doesn't mean we need to be naive, but we always forgive. And chapter 18, verses 23 to 5. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him, and as he could not pay, his lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children, and all his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, have patience with me, Lord, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the lord of that slave released him and forgave the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him by the throat, he said, pay what you owe. And then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you.' But he refused. And then he went and threw him into prison until he would pay the debt. And when his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed. And they went and reported to their Lord all that had taken place. And then the Lord summoned him and said, 'You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you?' And in anger his Lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart." Well, first thing I'm thinking is that the one who owed the smaller amount, if he's in debtor's prison, could never repay it. And the one who owed the huge amount, he's never going to pay it being tortured. He may want to. But the central meaning of this parable is that we each owe to God infinitely more than we can repay. Whether a large sum or a small sum, what is owed to us or that we may owe to another, it's insignificant in comparison to what we owe God, our lives. This parable summarizes the whole teaching discourse. The role of church is to forgive and restore. Our model is the great love of Jesus shown on the cross. Nothing less is worthy of our calling as Christians. Our purpose is not to teach adherence to laws and rules. It's not to condemn those who transgress, but to be examples of great love, mercy, and forgiveness. When we so desire to get it right by obeying the rules, we're kind of like the image of the cymbal player who has only one cymbal, even while promising himself, "This time I won't mess up," we inevitably mess up. It's only when we let go control and let merciful forgiveness guide our lives that we find ourselves on the path that Christ showed us. And there's one last verse, chapter 19, verse 1. When Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And the end of the teaching discourse, the end of book 4, is marked, as with the other books, by Jesus finishing his teaching and leaving to go somewhere else. God bless you today and always.